This video will continue our study in Psalm 114 as we illustrate successive steps in the exegetical process. We're coming now to interpretive questions. Notice what we've covered already. Location, that is, what are the reasonable upper and lower boundaries of any given text. Then we move to make observations about historical features, which cover a wide range of topics, whether it be historical figures who are involved in a text, or furniture, or climate, or political conditions, social customs. And then we built skill in observing literary features. Are there similes at work? Is there a continuity of theme? Is there a contrast of theme? And then we explored forming logical outlines, tracing the development of thought, concepts through this passage for which we've established the boundaries and then gotten acquainted with its historical and literary features. There will be a bit more observation that will come later, but we're moving primarily to interpretation at the next phase. Before we proceed into it, please review Psalm 114. You see it printed there on the left, and this is the logical outline on the right, so as to remind ourselves what some of the development of thought. I'll just pause. You can look over that, and then we'll advance to the next slide. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to study this further, otherwise we'll move on. At stage 3, that is interpretation, there are 3 main steps, and we'll just be focusing on the first one. That is interpretive questions, particularly these questions which the text itself hopes we will ask of it, and we'll talk about that further. Theological observation is that additional observation phase which appropriately we delay until this point, and this will be the subject of a later video, as will developing and crystallizing the central idea of the text. Let's focus now then on interpretive questions. In order to appreciate what we're trying to get at with interpretive questions, it's important to clarify what would be an informational question and how is that different than an interpretive question. Informational questions approach a given phrase or verse and simply ask, what information are you giving me? What is this phrase or verse trying to tell me? What question is it answering? Let's look at some examples now of informational questions. This is not where we're going to end up. It's just a launch point so that we can appreciate what are interpretive questions. Staying within Psalm 114, if we look at these phrases excerpted from verses 1 and 2, when Israel went out from Egypt, Judah became God's sanctuary. These can be queried with the questions, how did Judah relate to God? Well, Judah related to God as his sanctuary. And when did this happen? Well, this all took place, that is, God taking up residence in Judah, letting Judah be his sanctuary. That happened when Israel went out from Egypt. An informational question. Verse 3, the sea looked and fled, Jordan turned back. Informational questions that can be posed of this. How did the sea respond when God showed up? How did the Jordan River respond? Well, as for the sea, it looked and fled. As for the Jordan River, it flowed in the wrong direction. I wonder what informational question you could simply fashion given the statement we find in verse 4a, the mountains skipped like rams. Or from verse 5, why is it, O sea, that you flee? Or verse 7, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord. From each of these, we could generate informational questions. But an interpretive question is going to go deeper than simply saying, what does it say? Sometimes we explain the interpretive phase as asking, what does it mean? The observation phase is, what does it say? Interpretive phase is asking, what does the text mean? We will be generating interpretive questions, we'll be mining them out of the text principally from two sources. The first is going back to literary devices that we've already observed, and we'll be asking about their significance. This is something you've actually already done. Already you've been pressed so that whenever you identify a literary device, you wouldn't simply stand there and admire it, but you'd ask, what's it doing? What is its significance? That itself is the first phase of an interpretive question, anchored in a literary device. Another very important source for interpretive questions is to study your logical outline and the groupings of thought, and then formulate questions that bridge from one portion to another, perhaps from one 5-verse section to a 2-verse section, either adjacent or sometime later, and asking about the relationship between them. Often then, as you see at the bottom, interpretive questions will pose the interrogative why, or what's the significance, or how does this come about, or what's the importance of it, instead of just saying, what does it say? Here we acknowledge that already you have worked in the interpretive phase when you have identified a literary device and then probed it by asking, what's its significance? Now we're going to take that tact a little more broadly. The most fruitful of interpretive questions probe the text in order to let it express what it's uniquely configured to disclose. It's as if the text has a message it wants to convey. A certain amount of the message is released through the surface statements that are there. But as you know, upon reflecting and meditating and studying into a text, more insights come. So we're trying to use these interpretive questions to mine out that deeper level of inherent meaning in the text. We're not trying to impose meaning. We're just trying to overcome our inattentional blindness and, in a sense, liberate from the text what's already there that we don't see at first glance. The second sentence on the screen then goes back to the idea of questions that are anchored in the logical outline, seeking questions that bridge two or more portions of that outline. Can you appreciate that as you do so, it's as though you're getting up to a higher altitude? You're developing a comprehensive view of the text, not just stuck in minutiae, as rich as that can be, but looking at broader connections. Here we are then with Psalm 114 on the left, and the logical outline breaks are there, but on the right we're beginning to produce some illustrations of interpretive questions. Notice how they're structured. This is a bit formal, and it's to give us some shape for developing interpretive questions rather than just casting about widely. As you get comfortable with this discipline, you can leave this form behind, but for the purposes of assignments in this course, I will ask that you configure interpretive questions as you see on the right. So, question number 1. We're first serving notice. What is the literary device that this question is anchored in? Well, we have observed a continuity of theme, maybe synonyms or repetition of a concept. All right, what words does that consist of? Sanctuary, that's in verse 2, and presence of the Lord in verse 7. There's a similarity between those. Sanctuary is God's dwelling place, and then presence of the Lord puts you face to face with the divine being. So we've acknowledged the device, the actual words, and the verses where someone reading your work can find them. And here comes the interpretive question. What's the significance of this theme, this continuity, that appears early, verse 2, and late, verse 7, in this poem? Do you notice that we've got a literary device and it's bridging sections, so it's getting a high altitude view? The italicized statement at the bottom then is our attempt to answer it. We're not only formulating questions, we're going to offer our tentative answer. The poet seems captivated by reasonable response to the nearness of God. Notice that God showed up verse 2, and then there's a response in verses 3 and 4, a response in physical creation. God shows up in verse 7, and there's a response, a trembling, O earth, at his presence. So this idea of God coming on the scene and then observing how phenomena around him, around God's presence, react to his arrival. This seems to be the dynamic that's captivating the poet, at least in part of this poem. The fact that it's showing up more than once then may indicate that we're tapping into a central theme. Maybe not, but we want to be aware of it and watch. Incidentally, the answers here to your interpretive questions and the questions themselves, they will come from your own reflection. It's possible that later on, when you dip into a commentary, you'll discover someone else has wondered the same thing and offered some ideas. At this point, though, we're not limiting ourselves to report on questions for which we can find the answer in Dr. So-and-so's commentary. Go ahead. We're encouraging inductive study of the text at this point with minimal assistance from outside resources. Now, we did make an exception with historical observations. That was a point where it's a good idea to rather rapidly go to Bible dictionaries and commentaries to find out things that we wouldn't know otherwise. But right here, we're still wanting to activate and sensitize our own powers of observation. Here is a second interpretive question. We're serving notice of the literary device. Questions which may be rhetorical, may be actual. In other words, we're not quite sure yet at the formulation point. Which words are involved in these questions? Well, there's the expression, why flee, turn back and skip, verses involved, verses 5 and 6. And here then is the interpretive question. Are these rhetorical questions, or are they actual questions, that is, expecting an answer? And related to that, how may those questions relate to what follows in verses 7 and 8? I wonder what you think. Look at those. If there are rhetorical questions, then we should find no answer in the text. If they're genuine questions, then some of the text may serve to give an answer to them. We'll go on. There should actually, if you complete the assignment, you wouldn't just say, what do you think? But go ahead and speculate with your answer. A third question, beginning with acknowledging the literary device, contrast. The words involved will tell us what's in contrast. Rock and flint. First off, you might think to yourself, well, that's synonymous. Okay, it's synonymous, but when you think about it, can you detect any difference between a rock and a flint? This observation proposes there is a difference, and it comes out a little bit later. Where are they found? What verse? Verse 8. And now the interpretive question. What's the difference distinguishing these two items? Rock and flint. The answer that's proposed, a movement from general, rock is general category, hard object, geologic, to specific, flint. Flint would be subcategory, one type of rock. And when you think about that, what's being added by the presentation of flint? It looks like the writer is calling attention to rock that's really hard. And frankly, notice that there's water in the environment of verse 8. If you're going to get water from any kind of a surface, or a rock, it would be more likely you'd get it from a porous rock. But getting water from flint, that sounds really, really unlikely. So, a reduction of likelihood to find water emerging from the later of the two hard objects. That seems to be the difference that they're making. What we're tying into here is the possibility of a development, an intensification. That was a really narrow observation, wasn't it? Just within one verse, quite different than noticing presence in verse 7 and sanctuary in verse 2. Question 4 may resemble something in question 3. We've got a contrast going on between the words pool and spring. Again in verse 8, similar interpretive question. What's the difference distinguishing these? Pool and spring. Are you detecting that a pool may be stationary and spring is flowing? If it was up to me, I would be more interested in drinking from the flowing rather than the static pool, which is perhaps going to be stagnant. The parenthetical answer following then enlarges and links it back to question 3. Just FYI, this is not a necessary piece, but it's enlarging the discovery. So taken together with the movement from rock, general stone, to flint, specific and hard stone, unyielding, the effect seems to underscore God can transform even the most unlikely circumstance, flint, into the most refreshing supply, a spring. So we're moving to the second of both pairs, flint and spring. That's a remarkable picture, isn't it? God can transform not just a rock, but even a flint, and present us with not just a pool, which might be stagnant, but a beautiful, sparkling, refreshing spring. The last illustrative interpretive question here involves the literary device of contrasting ideas. So, what words are involved there? Trembling at God's presence, 3-4 in verse 7. Over against, gracious supply of water from pool and spring. Two ideas. And the observer is saying, boy, there's a difference between those. And you see the verses identified so that we can follow up and see it for ourselves. And now the interpretive question, a why question. Why did the poet shift from trembling at God's presence, ending the poem, right? Verse 8, choosing to exit this composition, this message, by attributing to God the power to miraculously supply? Why didn't he end by saying, God is so awesome that you ought to tremble, you ought to melt in his presence? End of poem. Why instead does he talk about God's overwhelming and, what shall we say, disabling power, unhinging us? But he doesn't leave us there. He leaves us with this winsome picture of God's provision in the most obdurate, the most unlikely circumstances. Maybe it's this, and now the proposed answer in italics. Perhaps we, as readers, are to realize that God's power is not primarily destructive, power that unhinges us, but ultimately and primarily it's compassionate. And either way, we should regard him with deep respect. I think I would add to that, either way, but especially with deep respect because of his compassion. That's the intent of that great power. This wraps up our portion exploring how do we go about delving into the text with interpretive questions. A subsequent video will explore the skill of theological observation.